Good evening, and welcome to the Modern Agora, where we tackle the most pressing questions of our time. Tonight, we are delving into a topic that affects our environment, our economy, and our ethics: food waste. Globally, it is estimated that roughly one-third of all food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted each year. The central question we are debating is this: should governments implement legally binding regulations to combat this issue, or should we rely on voluntary, market-driven solutions? To argue for regulation, we have Marco Bianchi, a renowned chef and a passionate advocate for sustainable food systems. And arguing for an alternative, market-based approach is Dr. Sarah Chen, a distinguished economist and policy analyst specializing in corporate responsibility. We will begin with opening statements, followed by a moderated discussion, and conclude with brief closing remarks. Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Evelyn. It's a profound moral paradox that in a world where nearly 1 billion people face hunger, we treat food as a disposable commodity. This isn't just about leftover meals. It's about a systemic failure that has devastating consequences, starting with our planet. Every piece of food that is thrown away represents a host of squandered resources: the water used to grow it, the land it occupied, and the fuel used for its transportation. When this food ends up in a landfill, it decomposes and releases methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than carbon dioxide. The carbon footprint of food waste is staggering, making it a major driver of climate change. For years, we've been told that voluntary measures and awareness campaigns are the answer. While these efforts are well-intentioned, they have proven to be insufficient. They're a gentle suggestion in a system that responds only to the firm hand of financial and legal incentive. Progress has been disappointingly slow because, for many large corporations, waste is simply a calculated cost of doing business. Therefore, we need a clear path forward, guided by intelligent regulation. We can look to successful models, like the one implemented in France. First, we should legally mandate that large supermarkets and food chains donate all unsold but still edible food to charities and food banks. This immediately redirects surplus from landfills to people in need. Second, we must standardize and clarify date labeling. The confusion between use by, which relates to safety, and best before, which relates to quality, causes consumers to throw away perfectly good food. A national standard is essential. Finally, we create a system of tax incentives for businesses that demonstrate significant waste reduction and penalties for those who fail to comply. This makes sustainability a financial imperative, not an option. This isn't about punishing businesses. It's about architecting a more efficient, just, and sustainable food system for all of us. It's a structural problem that requires a structural solution.
Thank you, Marco. Dr. Chen, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Evelyn. I want to begin by stating that Marco and I share the same goal. The scale of food waste is unacceptable, and we absolutely must address it. However, where we fundamentally disagree is on the method. Proposing a top-down, one-size-fits-all regulatory framework is, in my view, a blunt instrument that could cause more harm than good. Let's first consider the economic burden. Complying with such regulations imposes significant costs on businesses. We're talking about new logistical challenges for sorting and storing food, refrigerated transportation for donations, and extensive administrative resources for tracking and reporting. While large multinational chains might absorb these costs, they would be crippling for small and medium-sized enterprises, the local bakeries, independent grocers, and family-owned restaurants that are the backbone of our communities. Inevitably, these costs will be passed on to the consumer in the form of higher food prices. Furthermore, we must consider the unintended negative consequences. If businesses face penalties for having a surplus, their logical reaction will be to reduce stock to minimize risk. This could lead to less variety on shelves, reduced availability of fresh produce, and even localized food shortages. Forcing donations also creates a huge liability issue around food safety that charities are often ill-equipped to handle. But my main argument is this: regulation can stifle innovation. The most exciting progress we're seeing right now comes from a flexible, bottom-up approach. Think of the explosion of consumer-facing apps that allow restaurants and stores to sell their surplus food at a heavy discount at the end of the day. This is a market-based solution that reduces waste, provides revenue for the business, and offers affordable food to consumers. We're also seeing incredible corporate innovation in supply chain management, using AI to predict demand with greater accuracy. Public-private partnerships are forming to build composting infrastructure and educate the public more effectively. The government's role should be to act as a facilitator, to offer tax credits that encourage the adoption of these new technologies, and to support these voluntary partnerships. Let's empower innovation, not legislate it out of existence, with rigid, costly, and potentially counterproductive regulations.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Now we'll move into our discussion phase. Dr. Chen, I'd like to start with you. Marco argues compellingly that voluntary measures have failed to make a significant dent in the problem over many years. Why are you confident that the market-based solutions you describe can succeed where previous efforts have fallen short?
That's a fair question, Evelyn. The primary difference between now and a decade ago is the convergence of technology and consumer awareness. The landscape has fundamentally changed. The rise of the digital, sharing economy has created platforms for redistribution that are incredibly efficient and scalable in ways that were previously impossible. These apps connect surplus directly with demand in real time. Secondly, consumer pressure is at an all-time high. Today's consumers, particularly younger generations, actively choose brands based on their environmental and social credentials. Sustainability is no longer a niche interest. It's a powerful market force. Companies are realizing that reducing waste is not just good for the planet, but also good for their brand image and bottom line. My concern is that imposing a rigid regulatory structure now could kill this nascent ecosystem of innovation. It forces everyone down one path, when the market is currently experimenting with a dozen different, more dynamic solutions.
Marco, turning to you. Dr. Chen has raised valid points about the heavy logistical and financial burden on businesses. How can a regulatory framework be implemented without disproportionately harming smaller businesses and ultimately passing those significant costs on to the consumer?
This is a crucial point, and I agree that implementation must be smart, phased, and supportive. I'm not advocating for a clumsy overnight mandate that treats a small bakery the same as a multinational hypermarket. The regulations should be tiered. They should initially target only the largest retailers, say the top 1% of food businesses that are responsible for a disproportionately large share of the waste. These are corporations that absolutely have the capital, logistical capacity, and economies of scale to adapt. Simultaneously, the government should offer tangible support. The revenue generated from penalties on non-compliant corporations could be used to fund grants and tax credits for smaller businesses to help them invest in better inventory technology, or to subsidize the cost of partnerships with food donation logistics companies. We can help food banks acquire the refrigerated vans and storage they need. It's about creating a supportive infrastructure. Finally, we need to reframe the conversation about cost. Dr. Chen speaks of the cost of compliance, but she overlooks the immense long-term economic costs of inaction, the cost of environmental degradation, the loss of biodiversity, the strain on our water resources, and the health impacts of climate change are astronomical. Investing in a waste reduction framework is not just a cost, it's a strategic investment in efficiency and resilience that will pay for itself many times over.
Dr. Chen, Marco suggests a phased, tiered approach targeting only the largest corporations first. Does that not address your concern about the burden on SMEs?
It sounds reasonable on the surface, but it creates a different set of economic distortions. Firstly, large retailers don't operate in a vacuum. To offset their new compliance costs, they will inevitably squeeze their suppliers, who are often the very small and medium-sized farmers and producers we want to protect. So the financial burden gets passed down the supply chain, harming the little guy indirectly. Secondly, it creates an unlevel playing field. You're essentially punishing companies for being successful and large, while smaller competitors operate under a different set of rules. And history shows us that such regulations rarely stay limited. Once the precedent is set, there's immense political pressure to expand it, and it becomes a slippery slope until the entire industry is captured.
If I may, the supply chain argument assumes that the only possible outcome is waste. But the entire point of the regulation is to force large retailers to become more efficient. It pressures them to improve their ordering, invest in better forecasting, and create internal systems that prevent surplus in the first place. The goal is not to have more to donate. The goal is to have less waste overall. Large corporations have an outsized impact on the environment, and therefore, they have a greater responsibility to lead. It's not a punishment, it's proportional responsibility. We've trusted the market to solve this for decades, and in that time, mountains of food have been thrown away while people go hungry. The market has proven it cannot, or will not, self-correct this moral failure without a guiding hand.
We're nearing the end of our time. I will now ask each of you for a brief closing statement. Dr. Chen, you may begin.
Thank you. As I've said, the goal of reducing food waste is one we all share. However, the path we take to get there matters immensely. A path of heavy-handed government regulation, however well-intentioned, is a flawed one. It risks burdening our economy, raising prices for consumers, and, most importantly, stifling the very innovation that holds the true, long-term solution. The future lies not in rigid mandates, but in fostering a culture of responsibility. Let's trust in the power of corporate ingenuity, consumer choice, and smart targeted incentives. This is the more sustainable, flexible, and ultimately more effective path forward to a world with less waste.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Marco, your closing statement.
Food waste is a moral and environmental crisis, and a crisis demands urgent, decisive, and structured action. We've seen that relying on goodwill and voluntary measures alone is not enough to combat the scale of this problem. A clear legal framework is not a burden. It's a catalyst for innovation and a safety net for our society and our planet. It ensures that our food system values nourishment over profit and sustainability over convenience. Let's have the courage to implement the necessary regulations that will build a fairer, more efficient, and more resilient food system for ourselves and for all the generations to come.
Thank you both, Marco Bianchi and Dr. Sarah Chen, for sharing your insightful and compelling perspectives tonight. You've laid out the essential conflict clearly: the call for a structured, legislative framework to enforce change versus the advocacy for flexible, market-driven innovation to inspire it. As we conclude, the question remains for all of us to consider: what is the right price to pay for a sustainable future, and who should be responsible for paying it? Thank you for joining us. Good evening.